The first message arrived as a poem. It crossed the Pacific in a neutral diplomatic pouch, one of those canvas bellies trapped inside a Swedish consular flight bouncing down on John Rogers Field, Honolulu, May 13th, 1942. The clerk who signed a receipt wore a white linen suit and a habit of not reading what he carried. The aide who took the pouch to the Swedish consulate on Baratania Street kept the habit. The consul who slit the twine and spread the onion skin with a paperweight shaped like a walrus had the habit, too, until he didn't. Because the poem was in English, and because in 1942 English poems from Tokyo were odd. Midway's cistern sigh. Empty throats will call for rain. Boil, little island. The consul, who had spent the morning failing to make eggs that didn't stick to his pan, read it twice and said, "We ought to burn this." Then he folded it again, slid into a second envelope, and took a walk in the heavy afternoon heat to a coffee shop off Bishop Street, where a young woman with a coral pink brooch always sat near the window, pretending to read Das Magazine. Her name was Renée Aby, a Swiss journalist in what her editors called an airless posting. The British called her useful. The Americans didn't call her anything, because the Americans preferred their own ears. She had a habit of getting mail she shouldn't, and on slow days of making her own. "Another poem?" she asked. "From Tokyo," the consul said, "addressed to nobody, or to you if you like." She read it, blushed at the theatricality of it, and then blushed again at the fear behind the theater. "Midway," she said almost to herself. "Why Midway?" "Because we all live there now," the consul said, "on tiny islands with radios. For 1,000 miles east, in a building on Pearl Harbor's outskirts that hadn't decided whether to be a warehouse or a monastery, Station HYPO breathed through the night. Banks of captured Navy headphones hung from cubicle walls like bats. Every flat surface had paper pinned to it. Pinned paper had pencil on it. Pencil had numbers and columns, rows, jukebox strips of gin, 25 traffic that swam and shimmered until watch officers and linguists bullied the patterns out of them. Lieutenant Commander Hannah Walsh had learned two things in cryptography. Your job was to be wrong faster than the enemy, and you needed more coffee than was decent. She kept both commandments. Near midnight, she walked the aisle past the map with little red tags for keto butai sightings that never quite stayed put, past the chalkboard where the latest additives and super-encipherments slouched in a scrawl that only 3 men and 1 woman could read. "HYPO, Walsh," she said into the wire-worn mouthpiece when the buzzer went. A male voice with fatigue baked into its syllables. "This is Rockefort." She stood a little straighter. Commander Joseph Rockefort wore silk smoking jackets in rooms, with no windows and confidence like it was a uniform. "You got the AF thread," he said, skimming past greeting. "Pull." "Eh." The code group, everybody in the building had started saying as if they were talking about a person. AF needed water. AF had boilers. AF had what? The last week's traffic had thrown the same bones again and again. MIF, date unknown, early June, striking force to operate east of, and then math. "Sir, we don't have the date." Walsh kept her voice in the channel between modest and stubborn. "Unless we can force them to say Midway out loud." Rockefort didn't sigh. You never heard him sigh. You just heard the pause where the sigh would have been. "Then force them," he said. "Get Sand Island to transmit a water shortage. Plain language. Let Tokyo tell us where they're going in the clear." The idea wasn't new. False flag logistics chatter to pull a confirmation out of a proud enemy. The risk wasn't new either. If the enemy didn't bite, you taught him something about your curiosity. Walsh had argued earlier that the Japanese weren't listening to Midway's weather 12 hours a day in English. Somebody else had argued that Pride was a good listener. "Understood," she said. "I'll draft." When she hung up, someone in the next alcove muttered, "Tell AF the water plant is broken. They're mad for water. They're mad for a decisive battle," Walsh answered. "Water is just the prettier word." She drafted the message. She called it a plant incident report. She made it clean, domestic, dull. Midway Island AF reports potable water plant inoperative X request immediate supply of fresh water. She typed it on a machine, so old the zero had the decency to look like an O. She carried it like contraband to the little room where operators made English into weather. The message went out just before dawn. While the first gulls plucked intelligence from the gutters along Nimitz Highway, traffic cruised HYPO's receivers like ships edging into a far harbor. By mid-morning, a Gen 25 message of pedestrian cadence, but not trivial content, cracked into phrases under the collective pressure of Walsh, her code books, and a pot of coffee that had turned resentful. Am I striking force TO, proceed TO, AF? No, the grouping was off. TO, proceed to area of AF. Better, to commence operations according DateX. She circled AF with a dull pencil until the wood squeaked. 2 days later, the date shook out of another packet of additives like a coin from a child's fist. June 3rd and 4th. The board got new chalk marks. The men in white hats got new places to pin their cigarettes. Somewhere far to the west, a speck of a dot. This thing with the unromantic name of Midway felled it too. AF had gone from a code group to a bowl of sand with a target painted on it. It wasn't until that afternoon that Rene Abe's poem knocked politely on HYPO's door. From a neutral, Rockefort turned the poem over in his hand, smiling around the edges as if someone had told a good joke in a language he didn't quite speak. Who gave this to you? A Swiss in a city that isn't supposed to have espressos, said Lieutenant Tex Ellison, the naval intelligence runner whose talent for showing up with things he shouldn't have was his passport to every bad coffee in Honolulu. Says it came from Tokyo. Says it belongs to poetry. Says poetry belongs to the Navy now. Rockefort held it out to Walsh. She read it once and felt the back of her neck go cool. Midway's cisterns, she let the words sit in her mouth. Who in Tokyo writes haiku in English? And who mentions boiling on the same morning we sent a water ruse? You think it's a coincidence, Rockefort said. I've stopped believing in those, Walsh answered. I think it's a reply. A warning, Ellison said with a grin that didn't know whether to be cynical. Japan warns America, mind the trap. Not Japan, Walsh said. A Japanese. One person, someone close enough to feel the plan and far enough to be scared of it. Rockefort walked to the board and underlined AF with a stick of chalk worn to a splinter. Let's think less like analysts and more like priests, he said. Who would sin this way? Who could? Foreign Ministry? Naval General Staff? Somebody who thinks we can read purple and wants us to. Walsh said, everybody thinks purple is safe. The Foreign Ministry thinks it is money in a safe behind a picture of someone else's mother. Ministry men think about embassies, Rockefort said. This speaks like a man who's touched a deck. Or a radio, Walsh said. Rockefort wrote a list. Naval Staff to Center Channel via Foreign Ministry. Naval Attaché in Washington, Swiss or Swedish handoff. Intelligence section with a conscience chooses English to avoid Japanese censors. He capped the chalk. We don't interrogate poems. We hoard them, he said. Tell nobody outside HYPO. And tell Midway they weren't the only ones who said the word boil this week. In Tokyo, Commander Shigeru Akiyama wrote the haiku and stared at it as if it had written him. The room he had been given at the Ministry of the Navy was windowless and encrusted with files. The corridor outside filled with the sound of shoes and urgency. On the wall, a map pretended that maritime space could be tamed by a straight pin. Akiyama belonged to the growing class of Japanese officers who felt like men perched on rocks watching a tide they themselves had summoned. He had served as a wireless officer on Akagi in exercises that felt like theater with better costumes. He had been rotated to Tokyo for what the polite called staff seasoning, and what the impolite called exile for daring to say, at a dinner where the sake had been too pure, that Operation Amai was a prayer disguised as a plan. We assume the Americans will be drawn, he had said to a table that wanted pork, not prophecy. We assume we will surprise them. We assume their carriers will be where our carriers want them. We assume that God likes symmetry. He had not been shouted down. He had been ignored. Which was worse? He had a friend at the Foreign Ministry, a pale man named Shinpei Kondo, who understood languages like some men understand wind. Kondo had connections with the Swedish. The Swedish were connected to the world. The world, if delivered a whisper, might be saved from hearing a scream later. It was both selfless and selfish, Akiyama told himself. He did not want Akagi to burn. He did not want Yamamoto to be a paragraph that began with genius and ended with hubris. So he wrote a poem because messages dressed as the thing they were not sometimes got where they needed to go. He wrote it in English because censors bored by literature seldom had good English. He sent it to Kondo with the steel blue lie that it had been requested by Cultural Society. Kondo didn't ask which. Kondo owed him a debt saved from a winter 4 years ago when a file misplaced would have cost a career. Debts were kind of code, too. When the poem left his desk, Akiyama felt something under the breastbone like cowardice, then like relief. He would be branded a traitor by men who counted treason by the syllable, if he were ever discovered. But he was counting in ships, and ships had the weight of lives. He went to the ministry's roof, where the city ran to distance in blue and smoke. He watched a line of schoolgirls pass below. He thought about words, decisive battle, and how they came from old books written by men who had never seen what a bomb did to bone. He thought about illusions, the diversion, the parts of the plan that sounded like a stage magician's patter while the hands did something else. He whispered, in a language that had no syllable for blasphemy, "Let them see us." In Washington, the man Akiyama would have telegraphed had he been less a poet and more conspirator was having a bad week. Captain Sadao Shimada, Japanese naval attaché, had discovered that being a liaison in a city that did not wish to be liaised with was like being a music teacher in a place where the neighbors preferred hammers. His embassy had gone quiet since December. Purple sang in long-winded dispatches, but the notes were losing their music. Orders from Tokyo increasingly treated the foreign ministry like a post office and the Navy like a religion. Shimada had always imagined himself a lawyer in uniform. He paid attention to legal fictions. One of them was the fiction that Japan's war plans still accounted for American emotions. It did not. Men like Yamamoto had tried to talk of awakening a sleeping giant and temporary advantage filled the air like incense at a temple that no longer had gods. The attaché watched the Americans put on their grief like armor and call it industry. When rumors of an operation east of the Marshalls crept up through Tokyo dispatches, he wrote a letter he did not send. If you seek a decisive battle, do not write your enemy an invitation. Do not sail for an island whose name does not taste like victory in the American mouth. Midway sounds like a billboard on a road. It will wake the drivers. But he did not send it. He was a good officer. He was also a coward in the way good officers are. He preferred caution to court-martial. Then a poem falling out of the Swedish network landed on a desk he did not occupy, and he would never know it had ever existed. Meanwhile, at Midway, the desalination plant broke exactly on schedule. A burst pipe, a hiss like a snake, a puddle where puddles shouldn't be. Sand Island sent the plumbing equivalent of a scream. Eastern Island cursed and counted barrels. Men in khaki with sunburns for eyebrows shuffled crates and played cards on coils of rope and caught the scent of a battle rumor in the diesel stink. "We're out of water," a corpsman said. "We're going to have to fight thirsty." The PBYs came and went, fat gulls in navy blue, their crews practicing the cold-blooded rituals of reconnaissance that look like boredom from a beach. One of the pilots, a kid whose name would be a footnote one day and a grandchild's middle name the next, asked what the letters F stood for. The radio man said, "It stands for all FD." The kid laughed. The kid didn't mean to sound scared. On Enterprise and Hornet, miles east under a sky that did not care who owned the sea that day, Halsey's headaches were turning into policy. Spruance, fresh, sharp, a man with no legend yet. was already reading HYPO's summaries with a kind of neat hunger. Men at plotting tables moved carriers on vellum and tried not to imagine the decks as lungs. AF needs water, somebody quipped. AF needs us, someone else said. The room said nothing because they had all been taught that words like us needed to be rationed like fuel. Why would Japan warn us? The question came from a young officer at HYPO who had the kind of face you imagined in a peacetime photograph, sleeves rolled, a child hoisted on a shoulder. Why would any of them risk it? Walsh liked honest questions asked by honest faces. She said, because Japan isn't one person. It's 1,000 men with 1,000 persuaders in their heads. Some of those persuaders speak of glory from old Chinese texts. Some speak of coal tonnage. Some speak of a boy on a deck who thinks he will live forever. The officer said, "You think the boy wrote the poem?" "I think a tired man wrote it," Walsh said. "Tired of math, pretending to be fate." "What we do about it?" someone else asked. "We treat it like a bell in fog," Walsh answered. "We know what we already knew. We're steering towards something huge." When the Aleutian Deception opened with fog and Kiska names, HYPO's boards lit up in both directions at once. Walsh and her cohort let the ink run in two colors. The whole building felt like an orchestra warming while someone backstage still argued about which opera they were playing. The line that mattered was not on any chart. The line between confidence and hubris. On the last night of May, Walsh found a second envelope pushed under the door to the book room where she napped between message bursts. There was no wax seal. There was no insignia. There was only another poem, the same hand, the same English that felt like a suit from a good tailor worn by a man from another town. A hook in clear seas. Shadows where the bait should be. Fish that pull the boat. She carried it to Rockefort, who read it, smiled, and said, "God bless traders with good taste." "Sir," Walsh said, "this is more than a warning. It's a theory. The trap is for both of us. Whoever pulls harder drowns." Rockefort tapped the paper. "Remind me never to play metaphors with a poet," he said. Then he leaned against the table and finally let himself sigh. "Everything we're doing is about making sure the boat is ours," he said, "and that the rope breaks when they pull." In Tokyo, Akiyama watched the orders walk out the door in leather satchels. He watched the carriers depart on film newsreels shown in a canteen where sake couldn't look defeat in the eye. He drafted one more poem and almost did not send it. He considered a cable with declarative verbs: don't, stop, abort. Declaratives would get a man shot. He chose the old argument again: beauty dressed as treason. Kondo took the paper without looking at it and got it to the Swedes with a speed that surprised both of them. "I hope your conscience likes literature," the foreign ministry man said. "Conscience fell asleep in 1937, Akiyama said. "If it wakes today, it will be a miracle." In the hall, an admiral whose name Akiyama had been taught to revere stopped him and asked, "Do you believe in decisive battle, Commander?" "I believe in decisive numbers, sir," Akiyama said. "Then count this," the admiral said, tapping the map with a finger that had not touched salt in months. "After Midway, the Americans will sue for terms." Akiyama, whose hands had touched enough salt to sting, bowed so deep that several small lies fell out of his pockets. When he rose, his face had the calm of a man who had canceled all his investments. June 3rd smelled like aviation gasoline and wet rope at Midway. June 4th smelled like molten paint and paper and men. Between those smells, in a 10-hour corridor where the world chose one set of outcomes over another, the poems had no weight at all. Steel spoke. Water spoke. Fire spelled its own syllables on the sky in bright, hectic script. The boat that was a nation pulled hard on a line attached to another nation disguised as an island, and for a few minutes neither boat moved. Then one did. But that is the next chapter. This one ends with a woman in a bunker in Hawaii reading a radio log as if it were a nursery rhyme and realizing the rhyme had changed. "Enemy carriers sighted," she whispered. "God forgive the poet." "God," Rockefort said at her shoulder, more tired than victorious, Forgives better than admirals. They went back to work. Don leaned on the Pacific like a tired mechanic, hands flat on blue metal. From Sand Island's low roof line, Midway looked less like a fortress than a mistake the ocean tolerated. Turns strafed the surf. A PBY waddled out like a patient dog. The air smelled of hot rope and iodine, and under that, like an insult you couldn't ignore, aviation gasoline. Inside the radio bunker, Hannah Walsh bent over the log with the same posture she used when she said grace as a girl. Elbows in, eyes plain. AF to all units. A voice dry as chalk red. Enemy carriers sighted. Bearing 320, distance, updating. The voice did not tremble. You could write a book about men who swallow their tremors and call it soldiering. She felt Rockefort arrive beside her before he spoke. A temperature change, a pause. There it is, he said, the syllables thin with fatigue. They brought the hook. We brought the knives. On a different scale of map, miles to the northeast, Enterprise and Hornet combed their wakes straight. Wakes that would be read like handwriting by men peering through periscopes and by lookouts whose eyes had already been burned by a morning sun that had seen better centuries. Spruance stood under the armored bridge overhang, hat brim pulled low, the picture of a man trying not to picture. The battle would be fought by timers and altimeters, by men who would crash into a sea of arithmetic. A quip ran through the ready rooms. That HYPO would fight this one with them, but the grin hit a prayer. Launch the search, Spruance said. Then launch the punch. Another man might have waited for Halsey's swagger to fill the sky. Halsey was in a hospital with skin like a raw idea. Spruance had drawn the part in this play without rehearsal. He leaned into Rockefort's confidence as if it were a railing. Under him, engines throated. On the hangar deck, crews pulled chocks with the hunger of men who trust physics only when the wheels are in the air. The first American planes that found Nagumo's carriers came in low and slow and wrong. Torpedo 8, tin cans with wings, led by Wade McCluskey's courage and John Waldron's stubbornness and youth, saw the deep, sleek slate of the enemy decks and felt the primitive pull of attack. They went in. A generation later, old men would stand at the edge of library rooms and look at the display case where a Devastator's bent propeller sat and dab their eyes with county fair handkerchiefs. On June 4th, there was no handkerchief big enough. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, high, polished, murderous, came down like a bad memory your bones remember before your brain does. Zeeks carved the slow torpedo planes as if swatting flies with razors. The sea accepted each burning thing with metrics. It was the one honest accountant in the room. Somewhere under the massed fury, the trap's second jaw reset. Nagumo, who had launched one strike and now faced the old demon, what next, had ordnance on deck. He had armorers with their shirts off and their hearts in their mouths. He had squadron leaders asking 3 questions at once. Where is the enemy? Where do you want me? And what do we do about Midway's stubborn little airfield still snapping at our ankles? He had doctrine like a ghost at his elbow. Strike again at Midway, or rearm for the carriers we cannot see. Yamamoto's big brain hovered, unseen and away, tethered by radio. Decisive battle was the catechism. Decisive minute was the sacrament. The minute decided to be American. Later, after the reports were uncrumpled, after the dead had their best photographs chosen for the papers back home, Hannah Walsh would tell herself a story about how the battle turned. It would be a true story and a false one, like all stories about battles. Human choice braided with accident. She would say, Waldron went in, and by existing as a target, he tilted the sky. He moved Zeeks down to the deck and spread them thin. He kept Nagumo's head in the cockpit while his hands were on the flight deck. He made the enemy work. Then the dive bombers, late, wandering, almost lost in the ocean's geometry, arrived at the right height at the right second. McCluskey, reading smoke and faith, turned where a lesser man would have turned elsewhere. And then the universe did a simple thing. It paid out the rope where the hook was, and the boat that had pulled so hard found resistance in the wrong place. 2 minutes is a long time if you're cheating on your husband and your key is stuck in a lock. It is a short time if you are an aviation ordnance man on Kaga watching dauntless tip over like hawks. Walsh, at HYPO, listened to the radio traffic transliterate into history. The language of little voices, bomb, deck, fire amidships, the interrupting rattle of .50 caliber grace notes. A weapons officer's voice saying shit like a psalm. The high, thin carrier of static in which somebody's heart said mother and nobody transcribed it. Rockefort spread the latest positions on the table with two palms, as if he could hold the geometry in place by pressure alone. There, he said, not pointing at anything visible. There, and there. Walsh wrote in her notebook because writing is a kind of prayer, Kaga burning. Akagi burning. Soria hit. She did not write men. There was not a word good enough. On Akagi, Commander Shigeru Akiyama ran. The haiku man became a man in a corridor lit by a new physics. The oil in his nose, the paint pitching in a gas, the sound of metal rearranging its loyalties. None of that was poetry. The deck bucked under his boots as if the ship had become a horse that wanted the rider off. He saw a boy, the wireless kid who bombarded him with questions about American swing records. Look at the bulkhead with a child's certainty that walls saved you. The next breath made that certainty irrelevant. Akiyama didn't look for Kondo. The foreign ministry man was not at sea, and if he had been, Akiyama would have made him sit and watch. Watch what happens when plans meet heat. He climbed a ladder slicker than any he had climbed in his life, hands raw and reasonably sure they would die. On the hangar deck, ordnance burned with the hungry competence of men who had been taught that welding and weaponry were cousins. Bullets cooked off like carbonated drinks. The order to abandon ship came like a voice in a dream you cannot disobey. He found himself at the rail. He did what people in wars always do. He hesitated an extra beat not because he loved the ship, though he did, but because humans are land animals and the ocean is a different verb. Then he went over, boots first, a prayer in his mouth that didn't know Japanese from English. The water hit him with the intimacy of an old debt being collected. He bobbed. It is one of the few comic verbs the ocean allows. Around him, pieces of men and habits floated. A raft bloomed near his hand. He held. He put his cheek to the rubber, and in that second, the only poem he could remember was a stupid schoolyard song about fish. When he got his breath, when the first concussion shocks finished beating the big drum of his ears, he looked up. Akagi had become a mountain on fire. Beauty and catastrophe had conspired again to make art in the wrong place. Near him, a sailor whose rank he didn't know said, "Sensei," using the respectful word men use when they need to borrow dignity. "Will we die?" "Yes," Akiyama said, "but not this minute." He was wrong about many things in life. He was right about that. Back in Honolulu, Renee Abe lit a cigarette she didn't like. She had learned to smoke because spies smoke in the novels, and she wanted her life to have spine. The Swedish consul had slipped her a rumor earlier. Radios silent in places that should have been noisy, noise in places taught to be quiet. She moved through downtown with the soft and stupid joy people have on days that make sense only elsewhere. A sailor kissing a girl for luck, a street vendor cursing papayas, a boy with a yo-yo discovering gravity again. In a coffee house on Bishop Street, she placed a blank sheet of paper on the table and wrote 4 words on it. He warned. It mattered. It was a note to herself. It was also the story she would pitch to an American press attaché with good teeth and better ears. When Tex Ellison slid into the seat opposite her, smelling of cordite and typewriter ribbon, she didn't ask for confirmation. She asked for a table of contents. 3 carriers, he said. Maybe 4. Their torpedo planes flew like witches. Ours flew like angels or lunatics. Your poem friend's fleet bled. Name him, Renee said. I can't, Ellison said. Because I don't know. Because I don't want to. Because sometimes anonymity is the only medal a man gets to keep. She stubbed the cigarette on the ashtray with more force than polite. I want to write it, she said. Not the victory, the warning. People deserve to know that a Japanese man tried. People deserve a lot of things, Ellison said. Rations only go so far. He took the paper with her 4 words and folded it twice. Keep this in your pocket a few years, he said. Then write it. Maybe the world will have a mouth for it then. By noon, Soryu-S deck was a chalkboard where someone had drawn a sudden, permanent lesson. By afternoon, Hiryu, the one that kept its fury when the others lost theirs, sent 2 good, clean punches that cut Yorktown in the muscle and made the American side remember that traps don't care about uniforms. Hiryu-S dive bombers had flown like in a manual that had not yet been written. They dropped their eggs in a pattern that would be taught to boys not yet tall enough to reach pedals. For a few hours, Nagumo's force had a mouth again, and it bit. HYPO listened to the seesaw without dramatics. War on the radio is a weather report. Fronts here, highs there, temperatures you don't want. Walsh noted Yorktown damaged with a pen stroke that felt like guilt. She had not sunk the enemy. Men in the air and men on decks had done that. But she had named him, dated him, placed him. She had told Spruance where to put his patience and where to put his rage. And now the ledger threatened to go balanced, which is different from just. At 3 p.m., at a latitude that would become sacred to a very small church, Enterprise's bombers found Hiryu, and they gave back the arithmetic. When the black smokestack of Hiryu went to heaven, the nearest thing to silence all day fell in the HYPO room. A silence not of radios, but of posture, the way the human frame relaxes when a machine too big to move has finally moved. Rockefort took off his hat, the silk thing he wore like an argument, and set it on the corner of the board. Now we go from battle to consequence, he said. It's always the long part. Walsh set her pencil down. The ridges on her fingers from the pencil stayed like pale wakes. She thought of the poems and of a man sitting at a desk in Tokyo with his teeth in his lip and his hand shaking. She wanted to shake his hand. She wanted to tell him it mattered, even though it had not stopped the first flames. She wanted to tell him caution had done what courage could not. It had moved a date and fixed a place and made Spruance choose west instead of wait. It had made Midway something other than an accident. On Tokyo's ministry roof, the next morning, Akiyama held a newspaper that did not yet know what it was trying not to say. The headlines were about the Aleutians, about fog and glory. The telegrams that came upstairs on small, humiliating shoes whispered other syllables. Akagi lost. Kaga lost. Soria lost. Hiria lost. He felt the loss not as an abstract, but as a set of rooms vanishing. Wardroom, radio shack, the little bench by the bulkhead where Sato had eaten pickled plums and pretended to hate them. He lit a cigarette from a matchbook that had a geisha on it, a geisha whose smile had seemed ironic in January and seemed agnostic now. Kondo found him there, took one look at his face, and did not bother to say the novel's line. Are you all right? Because Kondo was a man who knew the difference between a person and a posture. We lost 4, Akiyama said. The emperor will be told we lost 2. The people will be told we lost none. The truth will go sit by the river and wait its turn. You look like a man who has committed a crime, Kondo said. I committed literature, Akiyama said. Kondo blew smoke with a scholar's care. If they knew you sent poetry to a Swiss, they would hang you from the flagstaff and call it a lecture in ethics. Would you attend? Akiyama asked. I would send regrets, Kondo said. I would also send lilies. They stood. Below them, Tokyo carried on with the decency of sewing. Above them, the sky did the same thing it had done for the Mongols, the Americans, the birds. It existed. You warned them, Kondo said. I warned us, Akiyama said. I thought if they came ready, the battle would be short. I thought if we failed quickly, someone here might be spared the long version of failure. The kind where you feed boys into furnaces for 3 more years because you cannot admit you set the thermostat. Kondo did not answer. He did something kinder. He put his hand, briefly, on Akiyama's sleeve, a gesture from a culture that often prefers the absence of touches. Go home, he said. Tell your mother you were at your desk all night. Drink tea. What will you do? Akiyama asked. I will translate the emperor to the people and the people to the emperor and hope my adjectives are merciful. In Washington, Captain Shimada polished his attaché shoes until he could see a man he did not respect reflected back. The embassy had received a stack of wires that felt like a funeral wearing a tie. His instructions were to maintain composure, to do nothing, to be, above all things, polite. He went for a walk on Massachusetts Avenue and discovered that Robbins had the bad manners to sing on days when markets crashed and fleets burned. An American naval officer he knew in the stilted way diplomats, no one another caught up with him, near a corner where a trolley squealed. I'm sorry, the American said in a voice Shimada would later remember as sincerely ill-suited to triumph. It was costly. Shimada bowed. War is very efficient at making sorrow, he said. It makes it in units. I read an interesting story, the American said, and Shimada's scalp went cold. That someone in Tokyo tried to tell someone in Honolulu that a trap is dangerous even to the hand that sets it. Shimada's mouth recollected its smile. If that is true, he said, it is because sometimes a man cares more for his ship than for his job. A man like that is my kind of enemy, the American said. Shimada bowed again. The code of his life chimed in his head. Loyalty, silence, decorum. Under it, another drum, truth. He wanted to say, my country is as many as yours is. Some of us plant traps. Some of us are afraid of what we will catch. Some of us think the word decisive should be taken out back and drowned. Instead, he said, perhaps in another century we will go fishing together. He surprised himself by meaning it. At HYPO, the celebration would have looked small to a man from the movies. There were no streamers and few speeches. Someone produced a cake shaped accidentally, like a code book. Somebody else found a bottle whose label had been loyal to a pre-war life. Rockefort made the only toast he knew how to make, short a little sideways. To people we will not name, he said. To people we will name too late. To the enemies who taught us something against their will, and to the friends who taught us something because they wanted to. To the day after, which is when all the bills come due. Walsh did not cry. She had a rule about crying while there was still traffic on the board. She put the poems, two simple sheets that had traveled like stowaways, into a brown envelope and wrote on it, A. Wollnings Anonymous. She slid it into a drawer where the good secret slept. Whoever he is, she said to Rockefort, I hope he lived. Me too, Rockefort said. So he can spend 40 years deciding whether it was worth it. Postscript, the men in small rooms. In 1947, in a library whose windows had learned how to forgive the weather, Rene Aby published a slim book called Islands with Radios. It sold badly and mattered quietly. In one chapter, a nameless Japanese naval officer writes 3 poems that function as messages in a bottle. In the last paragraph, the author allows herself one sentence of speculation that reads like a mercy. Warnings rarely prevent the event they warn against. That is not their task. Their task is to tilt the human, so that when the event arrives, it finds us less surprised than we would otherwise be, and perhaps a little less cruel in our conclusions. In 1958, a man calling himself S. bought a copy of the book from a secondhand shop in Shimbashi and annotated it in a neat hand. He underlined less cruel and wrote in the margin, yes. Also less stupid. He did not sign his name. He did not need to. In 1962, at a quiet ceremony in a Honolulu basement, an envelope labeled AF, Warnings Anonymous, moved from one drawer to another. Walsh, now high in the tree and careful of its branches, signed a receipt and carried the envelope to a room with better light. She read the poems again. The ink had not faded. Neither had the feeling. She told a visiting lieutenant the story in a short, thin way, how a ruse about water had baited a line, how a poem about water had answered the bait, how two kinds of language, not friends but not enemies, had crossed in the air between nations and made Midway less an accident and more choice. The lieutenant, who had a son named for a man who had died over Kaga, asked the wrong question and the right one. Was it necessary? Walsh said, yes. Then, after a beat, and no. Like every good warning. Epilogue, the haiku that did its job. At the end of his life, Shigeru Akiyama traveled by train to a seaside town where the fish were salted in the old manner and the children still swam in uniforms as if to remind the ocean who their friend were. He sat on a bench and watched a boy coax a paper boat into a puddle. The boat stuck on a bit of gravel and waited while the boy decided whether to unstick it. Akiyama took a pencil from his pocket and wrote 3 lines in a notebook his daughter had given him. Hookshrisht, ropes fray, even islands learn to float. When warned by the sea, he smiled at his own vanity, at the idea that the sea warned anyone. The sea did not warn. People did, from small rooms, with bad coffee, with words that looked like treason and turned out to be care. He closed the notebook. He looked at the puddle and at the boy who had decided to push the boat free with his finger. The boat leapt forward 1 inch, then another. That was all the progress the day demanded. Across an ocean and a continent, an old woman in Honolulu, Hannah Walsh, with a limp in her right knee and a neat hatred of fuss, stood in a museum nobody visited and read a placard about HYPO written by someone who had never sat in that air. She corrected a date with a stub of pencil she carried for precisely that reason. On her way out, she touched a glass case with a propeller blade in it, bent as if someone had twisted it with a god's hand. Not for nothing, she said to the propeller, which did not argue. If you ask a certain kind of sailor what Midway was, he will say a battle. If you ask a certain kind of poet, he will say a conversation. Between traps and warnings. Between plans and weather. Between men who wanted to win and men who wanted to end the losing. The rest is logs and maps and anniversaries. And that first poem, which crossed an ocean pretending to be a trinket, did its plain job. It made a small number of people in small rooms a little less surprised and a little less cruel. That is what warnings are for. That is why Japan, which is to say a man with a pencil and a conscience, warned America about the Midway trap.